What's going on, everybody? Patrick Connor here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. I'm here with my boy Aris Pina. We're here to talk a blend of boxing history and, unfortunately, once more, kind of eulogize a fighter that, I mean, this time we got to actually watch live. So it's kind of getting weirder and weirder and more unfortunate as we get older. Aris, I mean, apart from the obvious, bro, how you doing?
From unfortunate news that we got this past week and everything else has been cool. Um, on a more positive note, the Boxing Hall of Fame is coming up this week for their induction ceremony. And we talked about past shows and other things like that, and it's clearly not the same anymore. But all that being said, if you're heading out there, you're gonna have a good time because, passionate boxing fans will be there and it's always the place to be, I guess, for on weekends. I mean, for a Hall of Fame weekend. I can't even really talk right now, Jesus. So
Yeah, definitely not on normal weekends, I'll tell you that
yeah,
much.
yeah, absolutely fucking not on normal. All right, so like, but for induction weekend and stuff like that, like the Hall of Fame is usually if you've never been, then I always recommend you going at least once. So, you know, that being said, yeah, we got the news about Mike McCallum and like you said, Pat, this one actually hits really hard for not only for the fact that like he's one of everybody's favorite fighter, like just the absolute great technician, which we'll get into in a minute, but it's the fact that, like you said, it's starting to hit the reality that like these guys are getting older and they're starting to drop, and as we're getting older, that means we're watching these generations, guys that we actively watched start passing away. As a wrestling fan, it's different because a lot of those guys passed away super young for various reasons and all that other stuff. So I mean, you can people get jaded in that regard, but boxing gets different. These guys, we always hope that they like get older and that they have good post-fight careers and all this other stuff. And then, the chances that we get to meet them now, whether it's be at the Hall of Fame or other events and things like that, also social media, and we're able to like talk to these people now. You get a chance now that you feel like you're closer to them than ever. And so when a guy like McCallum passes away, and we were kids when we had a chance to watch him live, even though it was near the tail end of his career, it hits different. It's just like damn, reality sets in. We're older. Life goes on, and unfortunately, our heroes will pass away.
Yeah, our last show that we did last week, we talked about Nino Benvenuti, and a lot of not to say that Mike McCallum was worth more than Nino Benvenuti or anything like that. It's just that, as you said, we actually got to see him fight live. Even if it was the tail end of his career, Nino Benvenuti is definitely far more like separation. There's that happened a long time ago. It's a different era, and so that makes a lot more sense. He died old, whereas Mike McCallum was still relatively young. I mean, not a young guy, but younger than he should have been in terms of somebody living a full and fruitful life. But he definitely made his mark on the sport of boxing, and obviously enough that we're doing a show that we're going to be doing, kind of remembering his career, talking about some facts that maybe people don't remember, don't know about, and whatnot. So yeah, an important fighter in the last couple of decades, one of the greatest fighters of the last few decades, and somebody who kind of the name of his game was being overlooked, being underrated, being one of the best to do it, but kind of playing second fiddle or even third or fourth to a bunch of other stars who were active during his day. So unfortunately, that sucks that that's how he's often remembered because it shouldn't be. So we're going to try to, shake that off a little bit today.
Yeah, absolutely. He's one of those guys that I'm not going to say that like he's incredibly underrated because there are a lot of people out there that,
Sure.
respect and understand the play of his, how he played his trade. But that being said, like you just alluded to, the biggest fights that, especially that he wanted back in the 80s and, going into the 90s, stuff like that, they eluded him for various reasons. Some of them, some people say, oh, he got ducked, others, blah, blah, blah. There was always various factors of what was going on. And also as well, McCallum was always not like a crazy personality. He was always very kind of, mild and um just a very relaxed individual, you know what I mean? Like as you would see like how he fought. Like he wasn't a guy that had a very loud personality or he tried to be over the top obnoxious or anything. He was, pretty quiet, just chill and very subtle and everything in every which way. And so and during a time in the 80s when people are looking for like, superstars and big personalities, and you guys are like guys like Sugar Ray Leonard and Hearns and Hagler and, Tyson was on the scene at that point and other stuff like that. You have a guy like McCallum who's one of the best in the world, but it's difficult for him to really, have a chance to like show that to everybody.
Yeah, it was a little bit absurd too, because there were, excuse me, there were a number of kind of hardcore types during the time that definitely recognized that
Mhm.
he was a very, very good fighter. For instance, like, looking through uh, anybody who's, followed, even though I'm not as active on social media these days, you've seen some of the fucking photos that I've posted of the magazines and shit like that. And going through a bunch of the magazines, for instance, KO magazine used to have their what was it, the dozen, the
Dynamite.
dynamite dozen. Yeah, and so it was kind of like their version of like the top 12 pound for pound or the 12 best fighters in the world or something like that. And Mike McCallum was on that list, a number of different times. So, and on top of that, it's not like he wasn't recognized by the ring. I'm not trying to frame it like that. But the whole kind of thing was that there were hardcore types who did recognize he was among the best fighters in the world, except for the narrative was during that time in the mid 80s, it was like, oh, we got the Four Kings. They're the ones who replaced Muhammad Ali as the kind of stars or whatever in the game. So now who's going to replace them? And it was like, dude, you guys already have a bunch of stars. There already are a whole bunch of really good fight. Donald Curry, a bunch of really, really good fighters who were skilled. And, they might not have had like wild personalities, but enough personality to be stars. But they were just, for whatever reason, not embraced as like the level of those other stars. And so then they went right from those kind of four kings straight to Mike Tyson, basically. There was no layover for a guy like Mike McCallum, which sucks.
It's true, and it's kind of like you can almost compare him, I guess, in the sense to like Aaron Pryor in that way, where Pryor was chasing a lot of big fights in the early 80s, but obviously a crazier personality and
Yeah.
tumultuous life.
Obviously, much more a victim of his own,
Yeah, and tumultuous life,
doing.
things like yeah, and other things like that. And then also too, you come to find out that there were fights offered to Pryor that that he actually turned down, like a Duran fight, and there was a Leonard fight at one point that
Yeah.
was being discussed and other stuff. So, but that being said, what I mean is that like McCallum, who was looking for one of those star-defining fights. If it wasn't necessarily going to be the Four Kings, then he was still looking for another star, like, another guy that was near the top pound for pound, anyone that he can just like really ply his trade against to show the world that, he was the right dude. And then Pryor got that chance with Arguello, because he didn't get a chance to fight Leonard. He didn't get a chance to fight Duran. He wanted to fight Hearns. The guys he wanted, he didn't get a chance to. But then Arguello still being a superstar himself, that's what catapulted Pryor himself. And then, as we'll get later on, the same thing happened, like you mentioned with Donald Curry. That kind of happened for McCallum. But at the same time, McCallum was always one of those guys too. Like he was always just, even though everyone knew he was one of the best in the world, like you said, Tyson was dominating the era. There was so many other big personalities that McCallum was just always kind of on the back burner of that. But real ones knew. Like he was just, if you watched him, his style was just like brilliant. It's very like there was nothing flashy about him. There was nothing really over the top or anything like that. But he just did everything really just almost perfectly. Like he just you can see how he thought mid-fight, everything was going around, his body attack, everything around. Like he was just a brilliant, brilliant tactician. I just love watching him. My trainers would used to tell me, like the first guys I would always ask about who should I watch, and they would say McCallum, McCallum, McCallum. And then one of my old trainers, they gave me a video of him when he fought James Toney, of the first fight, and I watched that back to back until that tape wore out because I was just absolutely amazed that two guys were able to do something like that against each other. And it was like the perfect description, not to veer off course too much, but like when Miles Davis was explaining how much he loved boxing in his autobiography, he was going on at one part talking about how boxing is like, such an intricate art form where you have these two guys they're just trying to outthink each other. It's like, chess except you're fighting. And then he was like, it's not just, the stupid barbaric shit, his words, that people try to make it out to be, where two guys walk in there and slug and try to,
It's not
knock
just
each other's head off.
stupid barbaric shit.
Yeah. And I mean, as much as we love Gotti and Ward and things like that, there's a special place for a guy like McCallum because that's what boxing's supposed to be.
There are always going to be fighters who have flashy hand speed, explosive punching power, the kind of footwork that's like, whoa, dazzling. Lomachenko, Canizales, those kinds of fighters. There's always going to be fighters who have some sort of outlandish or really almost exaggerated qualities, and then there are always going to be also fighters who are far more understated and far more like well-rounded and far more like the kind of fighters who don't waste movement and who you kind of have to look a little harder because it's not like you could see what the fuck Roy Jones is doing, it's fucking obvious. You could see what Mike Tyson is doing. You might have to look a little bit with a guy like McCallum. You might have to look a little bit with a guy like Salvador Sanchez, somebody like that who you're kind of like, huh, like what is, like, oh, like so that's why he's moving that way. So that way when the other guy does that, he has these options kind of thing where, some people don't get to that when they watch boxing. Some people don't want to. Some people that's a little bit too much over analysis, a little bit too much intricacy in terms of the boxing strategy, and I get that. That's understandable. Some people just like the entertainment aspect of it, and that's cool. But if you are into a little bit more of the kind of technical aspects of it and of the why or whatever, and you like to watch fights, and you're just like, oh, okay, so that's how this happens. That's why this unfolds. Mike McCallum, like you said, your trainers are telling you watch that guy. That's why, because there's a lot to learn from it and a lot to learn just kind of watching it and watching him work. That was the thing. Incredible inside fighter and kind of a mid-range and inside fighter. And that's something that you don't see nearly as much these days. I mean, for a whole blend of reasons, which could probably like be its own fucking show. But there are a number of kind of skills and aspects of boxing that aren't nearly as taught or nearly as valued these days. Inside fighting, body punching, being able to actively fight in the clinch and not just hang on and look toward the referee to break you, several times a fucking round, that kind of thing. But like, actually being in there and knowing what the fuck to do. And in any case, that's a huge skill, and that's something that Mike McCallum had fucking, you know, in copious amounts, and
Mhm.
something that thankfully he was passing along, working along fighters in the gym. But incredible technician, dude.
Yeah, just someone that if you want to watch his fights, I mentioned something earlier when I was plugging our show that he reminds me like when you listen to a Dexter Gordon album. Do you ever listen to Dexter Gordon?
I don't think so. I'm not gonna lie.
Okay, yeah, I highly recommend him. One of my favorite jazz musicians you could, ever find. And Dexter Gordon's one of those guys that he's not underrated. I mean, he's extremely popular, like, even though he passed away like over, Jesus, 35 something years ago or so. But when you listen to his music, like there's nothing really crazy or flashy about it. He can get flashy sometimes, but I mean, like he was just very uh it's just beautiful. Like when you listen to it, it's just the most elegant, perfect shit. He had this deep baritone when he played, and everything was just, it was like the way that saxophone is supposed to sound. You know what I mean? Like when I mentioned how McCallum, like the way McCallum, I said like boxing's supposed to be, like the perfect technician. That's what Dexter Gordon was with playing the sax, and he influenced a lot of people that took it even further. Guys like Coltrane, guys like that came on after him like that, heavily influenced by Dexter Gordon. Like a lot of fighters that you've seen heavily influenced by Mike McCallum. He stood around a long time after his career ended as a trainer. The most recent guy, high profile guy he was working with, I believe, was Devin Haney. And as of not too long ago. So, he influenced a lot of future generations that came after him. And his
Well,
career
that's
started.
actually I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's also a really good point too, because it's like if you're speaking to or asking some of the best technicians you can think of, and they're saying, talk to that guy. You're
Yep.
like, well, then I guess I better fucking pay attention to that fucking guy then, eh?
And also too, the reason why I brought up the Jazz comparison is because like when you watch a guy like McCallum, also like when you watch a guy like Jersey Joe Walcott, Ezra Charles, other ones were just James Toney, early James Toney, all these type of guys were just brilliant to watch and just like perfect at their game. You don't even have to like have the sound on. Just watch it in the background, put on a jazz record, and the two things just like go perfectly together. You know what I mean? Like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which if you don't like one of those, then, I don't know what the hell's the problem with you, but that's what I mean. They just go absolutely perfectly together. And so McCallum, you know what I mean? The thing about too is that like he had a very, very long career, obviously starting from the amateurs. A lot of people wouldn't realize that he was actually in the 76 Olympics. One of those guys that, when we think about the 76 Olympics, obviously we always talk about the US team and what they were doing and stuff like that. But like there was a lot of like little Easter eggs, if that makes sense, in terms of like who else was competing there. For instance, Trevor Berbick, who was just still a novice, was representing Canada, and Mike McCallum, who was representing what, Jamaica.
Yeah, that same year actually. So he was 20 by that time too. Like he wasn't um or let me double check my math there. I'm not fucking Aristotle here, but let me double check fucking Pythagoras and shit. Okay, no, he was 19. He wasn't quite 20, but nonetheless, he was already nearly 20. And at that time, he had just like or going into the 1976 Olympics, he had just won the. Let me double check my shit here, the Florida Caribbean Golden Gloves welterweight championship, which is, I don't believe, on his box rec amateur profile. But in any case, he was an amateur champion. He was a high level amateur, and I think that it even says on his box rec something to kind of remember too. There are a number of kind of amateur records that people have memorized and shit like
Mhm.
that. Amateur records, generally speaking, aren't recorded like that. So anytime you get an amateur record, it's like what's being reported, and it
Yeah.
probably is not even correct. These days, it might be a little bit different since everything is fucking video recorded and shit like that now. It might be a little bit different, but back in the day, can't really take that, as fucking gospel. That being said, it even says on box rec, I think, for Mike McCallum's amateur record that like it's incomplete and they think that there might be upwards of 200 fights and blah blah blah. But yeah, clearly an extensive amateur record and an amateur record in international competition too, not just like local or something like that. But a high level amateur, and something that I was telling you before we started recording, just because I saw the it was actually Mike McCallum talking about it. So he wound up leaving Jamaica because, according to him, there were only about 30 active professional fighters. Or I don't even know if he said professional. It might have just been active fighters, period, in Jamaica at that time. And so he was like, well, I'm not going to get good. I'm not going to get as good as I want to be here in Jamaica doing that. And so he actually contacted a guy who defeated him a handful of times in the amateurs, Clint Jackson, who was a high level amateur himself and just missed out on winning the gold in the Olympics. And he contacted Clint Jackson, was like, I don't know what to do. I don't know anybody in the US, but I should probably come to the US for sparring and training because that's the only way I'm going to get as good as I want to be. And Clint Jackson said, yeah, man, come on over. I got you. And actually, Mike McCallum, who Clint Jackson was known as the sheriff, and Mike McCallum actually was for a while training and living with Clint Jackson and training out of I think it was the Nashville Sheriff Gym.
That's really crazy. And think about it too, because Clint Jackson beat him 3 times in the amateurs, at least on BoxRec, they fought 3 times.
Yeah, they
And
might even have been more than that.
yeah, because how many times were those guys fighting each other all the time back then, you know? And good point about the Jamaica.
And
How-
sorry, one more thing too. But
go ahead.
even though he wasn't known, I don't think for being from there, Clint Jackson was originally from Pensacola.
Oh, see, I didn't even know that either.
So they probably would have crossed paths even more because that's really all that the Caribbean would have been doing was like Florida, Caribbean, Florida, fighting each other and shit.
So like the Jamaica boxing back then, like you said, wasn't really huge. I mean, you had Bunny Johnson, who was I'm Bunny Johnson, correct? He was from Jamaica. He fought Eddie Perkins, I believe, for the junior welterweight championship. But other than that, there wasn't like a
And
huge
I think he fought out of London too.
Bunny Johnson.
What didn't he? Well, God,
Or,
now
or no,
I'm
no, I might be with the wrong guy. I might be thinking of Bunny Grant.
we know like nine different bunnies, so we're
Yeah,
like, hold on a second, give me a second.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
It was Bunny Grant from Jamaica. Okay.
yeah, because Bunny Johnson was part of
Yeah,
the
Bunny, yeah, yeah,
Windrush.
yeah.
Yeah,
And he was and Bunny Johnson was a light heavyweight and stuff like that. Yeah, Bunny Grant from Jamaica. And he was a huge star, obviously, because he was one of their first, big fighters. And then he lost to Eddie Perkins. And after that, there was there was others too around. Like, you had the promoter, there was a guy by the name of Lucian Chen back then. And if no one's ever heard of his name, the reason why I bring him up just because it's absolutely hilarious is that he was the director of a boxing film that a lot of people probably don't even know this that Bob Arum was in, called The Marijuana Connection or something like that. And yeah,
yeah.
Arum,
There's the fucking what do you call it? The movie poster floating around somewhere, and
yeah,
Aram's on the fucking poster.
yeah, he plays as one of the drug dealers in it and stuff, right? And then at one point, they got guns mixed up in it, and apparently there was a real bullet in the part where Arum was supposed to get shot, and Arum could have almost got killed until you know, like it was fucked up. But anyways, it wouldn't be until like the 80s again when guys like Simon Brown and like Richard Shrimpy Clark and others would start coming on the scene that Jamaica started becoming um popular for boxing again. But yeah, like when you look at a guy like McCallum's record though, like you said, he lost to Clint Jackson a few times, but also he beat a lot of really notable names. For instance, one name I did not know he fought as an amateur, and I find this absolutely astonishing, was Bruce the Mouse Strauss. See, when I think of the Mouse Strauss, and the people who listen to the show, they're definitely familiar with him. He's one of the more colorful personalities of the '80s in terms of being like in terms of journeyman. One of those like popular journeymen. Like everybody seemed to know him. I think he was even on Letterman at one point. And but he
Yeah,
was
they
one.
did like a big feature on him in Sports Illustrated, which is like
Yeah,
he had boxing cards when they were doing boxing cards in the '90s and shit.
they made
Like
a
you
movie
said,
on him too.
kind of strange for like a straight up journeyman, you know?
Yeah, but I didn't know he was actually an accomplished amateur. And when he fought McCallum, that was actually the what was it over here? I just had it up. Oh, it was for the 1976 Florida Caribbean Golden Gloves Welterweight Open Championship. So there we go. Bruce the Mouse Strauss. One of those guys that, like you said, he fought everybody, everywhere, any place, anytime, would fight multiple, sometimes a few days the same week. Didn't matter. There was really one funny story where he did fight a televised fight against a very young Bobby Chez in 1980 on ESPN when it was still young and fledgling. And after Ches knocked him out, a few days later, he appeared at another card, and some guy apparently in the audience yells out, "Didn't this bum?" He's like, "Didn't I just see this bum get knocked out on TV the other day?" And Strauss turns over and goes, "That was my." He was like, "That was my twin brother, the Moose. I'm the Mouse." And he went to go fight. So another name as well was I see over here Bruce Curry, who was the brother of Donald Curry, and another very, very talented fighter, unfortunately kind of eccentric in the head and stuff. But, you know, he had a really accomplished amateur career. And interesting enough is that after the 76 Olympics, he stood as an amateur for until about like 1980. And had the US not boycotted, I don't know if he would have made the team because there was a lot of really stiff competition as an amateur back then. And it shows that the last fight that on BoxRec over here was against Alex Ramos, who Ramos was an absolute terror as an amateur. No one was really touching him back then. So, I mean, it would have been interesting, but he turns pro in 1981.
Yeah, so and you can also see the right around 1976, 1975. If you go to his amateur career, you looked at like all of a sudden he's fighting in the US and a lot of US tournaments. Uh
Winning the Golden Glove, fighting the Golden Gloves. Yep.
and so you could see that he's obviously training in the US and probably, got the benefit of getting better skill wise, training around a much wider array of fighters and better fighters, etc. And so turning pro, you can, gosh, I'm trying to remember which magazine I was reading the other day, but there was a fucking feature on him when he was like something like 10-0 or something like that. He was pretty young, might have been Boxing Illustrated, but in any case, he was very early in his career and he was very highly thought of. It wasn't like he was not recognized at all. It's just that, like you said, this was kind of, we've gone over this in other podcasts, so I don't want to get too deep into it, but just to kind of set the stage so people understand that there was a big revival of boxing in the wake of the 1976 Olympics in the US. I mean, obviously not to the degree where it was popular before that, but it really rose in popularity because a lot of people were like, TV has killed boxing. They're doing closed circuit now. That's killed boxing. All of the smaller promoters and club promoters are dead and blah, blah, blah. And this kind of was 1976 Olympics, that is, was a big shot in the arm. And that being said, there was also, like you said, really stiff competition, both in terms of, excuse me, amateur competition and then fledgling pros. Look at all of the early 1980s magazines and newspapers and other media, and there's just young stars being fucking featured left and right. Tomorrow's champions, and then that was kind of like a rotating cast too. It's like there was like who, I don't even know the complete list of who tomorrow's champions were because it was like they were fucking like everybody was tomorrow's champions in that fucking group. But like the point being that there was just a ton of young talent coming up at this time, and so Mike McCallum kind of was getting lost in the shuffle. Even so, still recognized as a top amateur in the kind of Florida Caribbean area and a top level international amateur who was highly accomplished and somebody to look out for.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was one of those guys, like you said, it was like fledgling pros. And like, the thing about, the pro game back then was that like you weren't just being fed a bunch of stiffs and all that. These guys, when you're turning pro, even if they didn't have the best records, you were fighting, reasonable competition. And when he turned pro, like he was kind of based out of Tampa and in the Florida region early on. And his first fight actually takes place at the Silver Slipper in Las Vegas. That was one of the old club shows that they used to do every Wednesday was a Silver Slipper at Vegas, and they would usually sometimes they would feature like top guys, former world champions, stuff like that. But usually it would just be like club fighters and other ones, and going to get it and stuff like that. But they were really really popular, and a lot of future stars and older pros and stuff like that definitely fought at the Silver Slipper at one point. So like we said, he starts out in Tampa, and I didn't even realize again he ends up fighting Bruce Strauss as a pro early on. At this point, Strauss is already like, head deep into his in his role as a journeyman because he has over 60 fights at this point, and this is already in 1981. And then soon enough, he fights Jimmy Hare, who was another guy that had a long career that fought Duran and everyone else with over 100 pro fights. But it wasn't until around 1982 when he fights our old friend that we talked about on another show, Ayub Kaluli.
I just wanted to, since you brought up the Silver Slipper, I wanted to throw in a little extra bit of trivia there.
Oh, please.
The fucking Silver Slipper is generally thought of as the venue, and like you said, that they had a fight of the week that they
Mhm.
would a show that they would do every week, and I don't know for how many years that went on. Bless you, but it was basically like thought of as the venue and the show that came up with the concept of the ring card girl.
Oh, see, I didn't even know that. That's pretty awesome.
Yep. Yeah, that should basically. I can't remember the promoter who was operating there at the time. I'd have to look it up, but we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. We're
Yeah.
going back to Mike McCallum. But like the competition was so stiff during this time that I think that a lot of fighters, it was still in an era where you weren't really like expected to like stay undefeated. You know what I'm saying? Like this was still at a time where losses were somewhat expected. It was changing. It was definitely leaning more toward, they wanted fighters to stay undefeated as TV became more of a factor, and TV dates became more of a
Mhm.
factor. But still, like, taking losses in this stiff era was not the end of your career. That being said, even just going up uh, Mike McCallum's record from that kind of Bruce the Mouse Strauss, to Ayub Kalule time period, you don't really see a whole lot of fighters, and I'm not saying they're good fighters, but most of them are experienced. Most of them
Yeah.
are fighters who are like, they're fighters. They're people who make their living fighting and shit like that. And then, getting in with Ayub Kalule, we just talked about him a couple shows ago on the kind of like forgotten fighters or, underrepresented or whatever fighters. And so a very talented guy, a very good fighter, but like, probably not the most durable fighter, but a perfect foe at that time for Mike McCallum to kind of take the next step into, getting into the contenders.
1,000%. And when, a guy like Kalule, like you said, he didn't have a bad record at this time at all now. He was only 40-2. I think his two losses were to Leonard and Davey Moore at this point. Both in title fights, so no shame in that. But like you said, he was already on the downside, and for a guy like McCallum, this was a huge step up, but one that is, that his managers and stuff were pretty confident in taking. And I mean, like you mentioned too, like guys could take losses back then, it wouldn't be the end of the world because there was a lot of people in Ring Magazine and other magazines, they were still featured as new faces, but they even had like one or two losses on their record, you know? But they were still like they'd be 14-1 or like 16-2 or something like that, and they were still being featured in a magazine and talked about as an up and coming guy. It wasn't the end of the world. And even in fighting a guy like Kalule, had he lost that fight, they just would have been like, well, it was a really good learning experience for him because a lot of guys sometimes stepped up and they would lose that first fight, against a former world champion who just ended up being was like a little too, what's the word, wily for them.
Yeah, it
And
just
yeah.
like overreached at the wrong point in their
Exactly,
career or
yeah, and
whatever. Yeah.
they still had a little bit left in the tank that no one really knew they had left in there and just, able to eke it out. That being said, that didn't happen to the Kalule fight. This was, McCallum's finest hour at this point as a pro, and in a good fight, he broke him down, showed why he was starting to be called the body snatcher, and Kalule eventually, was beaten down and broken up and stopped.
Yeah, he well, and I think that it was a bit of an eye-opening sort of fight too from McCallum because he like stormed out, scored a knockdown in the first round, and then just broke him down, which
Yeah.
was that was the fucking Mike McCallum special, dude. Breaking fighters down. He did have some kind of earlier or early-ish knockouts or one-punch knockouts, but not a ton of them. He was more of a kind of just like beat the shit out of you over the course of like 5, 6, 7, 8 rounds type of fighter. And I mean, that's he hit hard enough that generally not a one punch guy, but his shit hurt.
And if he wanted to throw down with him, he had no problem obliging on that too, because he had a world-class chin, as we'll talk about in a future title defense. But I wanted to ask you, when do you remember he got with Emmanuel Stewart?
Oh no, I don't know. I mean, it actually, well, it might say on his box rec. Sometimes they have a little, uh, yeah, I don't know.
I'd have to look it up. I know it was around this time though, because this was around the time when he was, approaching becoming, I want to say WBA number one and the number one contender for the WBA title at this time. And McCallum's a junior middleweight, and at this point, I believe he was with the Kronk. I think, yeah, he was probably with Kronk at this point, and he was managed by Emmanuel Stewart. Stewart had all of his champions around this point and stuff as well. And so what they were trying to angle for, since he was the number one contender for the WBA, was that they wanted him to fight Duran. And he wanted to fight Durant, obviously. You know what I mean? That would have been a huge fight for him. Durant, obviously, massive name, and the resurgence that Durant had after he beat Davey Moore, and then moved up and he almost beat Hagler and all this other stuff. Like it was a big fight.
So sorry to, but
No,
I
no,
just,
please,
I
you
just
got it.
see, I see right now. So it would have been in about like 83
Okay,
that he
yep.
got with Stewart. McCallum split with Stewart in 1984 after the Kronk manager arranged a fight between Roberto Duran and Kronk's
Yeah,
Thomas Hearns. McCallum felt the fight should have been his, but Stewart has said that Duran would never fight McCallum. McCallum then hooked up with Lou Duva and won his title in 1984 with a knockout of Sean Manion. So
yeah.
yeah, it. I don't know the ins and outs or if Emmanuel Stewart really was correct and Roberto Duran would have been like, "Fuck that, I'm not fighting Mike McCallum." Maybe he's correct. I don't know, but nonetheless, there you go. That's why they split, and that's
Yeah, I knew that was the reason why they split. I was trying to wonder like when he
so. It
got
would
when
have been shortly before
yeah.
that, I would imagine.
But it's understandable why McCallum would feel very, very slighted by that. This was a huge opportunity for him, and he wanted that fight. But at the same time, even though Emmanuel
And
Stewart said that Duran would have never fought McCallum, think of it like this too. Cliff Rold, great historian and friend to the show, he made a good point on Twitter where he said that you don't duck somebody to go fight Thomas Hearns. Like, you know what I mean?
that's my issue with the prior shit and
Yeah.
with all of that's my issue with all of this is that that's not a duck. You know, like you don't. Yeah, like all of these, you can't. That's not a duck. Not fighting somebody to go fight somebody who is more accomplished and
Mhm.
overall better. That's not ducking. That's fighting somebody who's more accomplished and better. And that's
I mean,
not
it's
a
just a
slight
bigger
to,
payday too. Yeah,
yeah,
it's
and
just
it's not a
oh,
slight to
that
Mike
that
McCall.
big.
Again, it's so, and not to defend Emmanuel Stewart either, because I don't know the situation. Maybe Manny totally dicked him out. I don't fucking know. But that's not an uncommon situation in boxing gyms or in boxing stables either. There's gonna have to be a little bit greater fucking. We just saw this with We see it with Ryan Garcia like every 18 months. Every time he changes a fucking trainer, like he's not paying enough attention to me. You know that's how it fucking goes. But that's how it. That is literally how it goes. A trainer and especially somebody who's like a trainer slash manager is going to spend a bit more time on the fighter who's commanding more money, who's the bigger star, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is like a tale as old as fucking time. Doesn't make it right. It is unfair for Mike McCallum for sure. But I think that also, you know, the tale here and the not the moral of the story, but more just the kind of like the kind of person that Mike McCallum was, to his credit, is that he made his own way, is that he didn't rely on the stars. He wanted them. He wanted these big fights and he wanted all of the, you know, he wanted all of that shit. But then when they wouldn't hand it to him, even though he probably deserved it, he said, fuck it, I'm going to take something else anyway, which he did. And so, you know, that's kind of the silver lining or whatever in him not being able to get those fights, which sucks, admittedly,
Mhm.
because I mean, would he have beaten Roberto Duran at 154 pounds at this time? I can't say that he would have beaten him, but that would have been a hell of a fucking fight. I'll tell you that much.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I tend to think that McCallum wasn't even really peaking at this point, anyways. Too, he wasn't really at his absolute prime yet. Like he was still, he was close enough to it, but it wasn't like really quite there yet. So like. He doesn't fight Duran, like you said, and you know, it sucks for that because he did. He took that very personal with Emmanuel Stewart, and he promised himself after that he was gonna go on a one man crusade to beat up all the Kronks guys that he was able to get his hands on at some point. So Duran, obviously, like we said, he gives up the WBA title to go fight Hearns for the I think the WBC. And then after that happens, um he gets the fight instead for the vacant title against Sean Mannion in October of '84. Sean Mannion wasn't a bad fighter at all, but I mean, he was just a guy that like he had a definite limit to where he was going to be at. You know what I mean? And this was more so going to be like for
Yeah.
everybody watching this fight that they knew what was going to happen. It wasn't going to be a big deal.
Irish dude who fought out of Massachusetts,
Mhm.
popular crowd favorite type of, you know, Shea Neary type of guy who was like, you know, very popular in that region, but outside of it, not gonna be super successful type of thing.
Exactly. And two things that are notable about this fight that McCallum won a wide decision with to win the title was that this was the first time two female judges scored a world title fight, and McCallum became Jamaica's first world champion.
Hell yeah. Love it. Fucking love it. Yeah, and Jamaica was kind of just entering the world stage, and in terms of world title, obviously.
Mhm.
And we just talked about, that it was thin. Like there weren't a whole lot of fighters, or there weren't a whole lot of big name fighters from Jamaica who had made it onto the big stage. And just like the 1976 Olympics did in the U.S., Mike McCallum inspired a lot of Jamaican kids to get into boxing. And there was we saw a big explosion in the late 1980s and early 1990s of fighters all of a sudden coming out of Jamaica, which is, obviously fucking fantastic. But yeah, so he defeats Sean Mannion, wins a world title finally under the banner of Lou Duva, who, people can say a lot of shit about Lou Duva. He was definitely a little bit of a kook, definitely flew off the handle fairly easily, definitely in some ways that were ill-advised too, like, against like other trainers and shit who were like actually in shape and shit like that, for instance. But that being said, he was a good manager, and the Duvas did know what they were doing as far as handling fighters. And
And
they,
George Benton was his trainer at this point too, because Benton was with the Duvas. And I
yep,
mean,
exactly.
think about the mind that Benton has, and then think about the mind of McCallum. You put those two together, that's just, I mean, that's like a superpower right there.
Well,
That's
and
absurd.
I'm sure that McCallum would have picked shit up from Manny Stewart too.
Of
You
course,
know what I
yeah, yeah.
mean? Like he
He picked,
was.
I mean, he had, think about this, like he had Manny Stewart, he had George Benton, and then eventually he gets with Eddie Futch. Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite the spread, dude.
I'm saying, like, Jesus. Talk about like, there's been a lot of Mount Rushmores for different things going on like on Twitter and other stuff that various things, whatever. And you want to put Mount Rushmore of trainers, those three guys are, you can nominate immediately for that. So,
Yeah, oh yeah. There's absolutely no question. Among the few best trainers ever that you could possibly have. And Mike
mhm.
McCallum spent significant amounts of time with all of them, and basically, you know, um, he didn't exactly go through the division at this time, and there was enough talent in the division that would have taken a little bit of time, but he did wipe out a couple of very good fighters, probably the most notable at this time being an undefeated Julian Jackson, who was, I mean, not the greatest stoppage on the face of the planet, but still, a fairly fair stoppage. And especially when you consider that Julian Jackson, we found out later, didn't really have the greatest chin. So it probably would have gotten worse from him there, but nonetheless took his O. And
Mhm.
that's pretty big, and probably the first big stage fight for him where he, kind of bursted through.
Oh, for sure. First he fights another. Well, I mean, I just mentioned saying that he was going to be on a crusade against the Kronk gym. The first guy that he took on out of that part was a guy named David Braxton. David Braxton never won a world championship, but he was a integral, definitely a central piece of the Kronk team in the early 80s. If you see all of those old posters and, Emmanuel Stewart Enterprises and stuff like that, Braxton is prominently centered there. He had an afro, you can see him posing,
Yep.
whatever. And McCallum beat the shit out of him, like, pretty badly. He definitely whooped his ass in that fight and ended up stopping him. So that was like, the start of it. But like you said, the Julian Jackson fight is fascinating because Jackson in 1986 was just on a rampage. Early Jackson, there's like highlights videos of him. You see him with in his early days when there was like the big Don King logo he would fight on and stuff like that, and he was just wrecking dudes left and right. And he
And then
basically
doing the moonwalk.
hmm And then he thought he'd be able to do this, kind of the same thing with McCallum. And in the first round, it almost looked like it could happen because Jackson actually rocked him badly. McCallum was there trying to, Jackson came out guns a-blazing. McCallum wasn't going to run for him. Like you said, he did his best work on the mid-range and inside, so he fought right in there with him. But he got caught. At one point, Jackson catches him. You see McCallum's leg buckle, and he's just like, oh shit, like, he's like, I gotta get going on this one and take his ass out because I don't
Yeah, I
need to
better
be
not let
dealing with
this
him.
guy get rolling.
Yeah, yeah, I can't let him like really keep on going with this. So round two, after that first round two, McCallum comes out with even added thunder, and he was like, "All right, now I'm just, no more time for bullshit." And like you said, stops and ends up catching Jackson and stopping him, and that was a huge. Um, Still, that wasn't like the big marquee fight he was looking for, but that was like a big step in the right direction, like a big jump in the right direction. A couple of more defenses against a guy named Sid Skuma, who also fought Buster Drayton for a junior middleweight championship. And then he fights Milton McCrory. Milton, this is a big fight as well because Milton McCrory had only one loss at this point, and that was against Donald Curry. Was the former welterweight champion, major star of the Kronk gym, and one of those guys that, like, after Hearns, he was looked upon maybe as like the second best guy in the gym. And knowing that the grudge that the McCallum had with the Kronk, and now he already beat up David Braxton, McCrory was looked upon as like the guy that's to bring back dignity and avenge that loss. And instead, McCallum put on another prolonged beating and like basically ended McCrory as the top fighter at this point.
Yeah, McCrory was definitely a really talented guy. It sucks because obviously now he's more remembered for the, like
Yeah, the
being
Curry knockout. Yeah,
because that was just a brutal. Oh, dude, that was just not. Was that Mills Lane?
it was.
Unfortunately, yeah. He usually was a very solid ref. That was not his finest call right there, letting Milton McCrory just get fucking smashed with that final
Yeah,
shot.
because it probably should have been stopped after that first knockdown. Like he got caught with that hook and he went down hard, like
Yeah.
hard, hard, hard. And then he got up and he just kind of stood there motionless. And I guess the best comparison you can make more recently would be Fernando Montiel against Nonito Donaire. Remember when
Oh man.
and they let Montiel get up and he just stood there like,
Yeah, that was yeah, dude, he was like
yeah.
and then Russell Moore's like walked to me and he was like and
Didn't
he
he
was like,
could
"Okay, continue." I was like, "No. No."
and that was McCrory against Curry. Like he gets up and he just stares blankly ahead, has no idea what the fuck is going on. And then Curry just ran across the ring and oh my God, I'm sorry. It
Oh
was the
no.
dumbest thing I couldn't. I told you how I took a fall and fucked up my finger, and I just do
Oh
that.
man.
Oh my
Oh
God.
no.
Okay.
This one's for
Remind
you,
me not to
Milton
get into a
McCrory.
fight tonight. Anyways, um, so he ends up stopping Milton McCrory in another highlight reel performance. But I was after this fight where he gets the marquee big fight that he's really, really been looking for. Not that the McCrory fight wasn't a big fight, not that the Jackson fight wasn't a really, high level fight, but this is the fight where where he's finally get a chance to fight a fellow star, a guy at this point who was looked upon as potentially the pound for pound best fighter in the world, and a guy that was supposed to move up and beat Hagler. But, his career went a little awry instead at some point. But this was like his big comeback, and that was Donald Curry. This was a big fight. This was McCallum's first time on HBO, I believe, on unless he fought Manny on HBO, because that was the Hagler Ham Show undercard. I'm not sure if that was aired or not.
I'm
Anyway,
not sure.
yeah. But and if
Well, in
either
any case, this was obviously his big, showcase.
actually, yeah, exactly. This is his first time as a main event on HBO, and this was a big fight. Like even though Curry had lost to Lloyd Hunnigan, and basically the biggest upset in the 80s up until that point, probably. It was still even it was looked upon as like okay he just maybe had an off night whatever it is like what I mean now he's at junior middleweight he's not struggling to make 147 anymore all this stuff and even though McCallum is a high level champion undefeated and everything like that this is Curry should be able to beat him if he's still going to be the Curry of old.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think that there was obviously some question. Like, not everybody really knew exactly uh what Curry had because, like you said, that was such a massive upset. Second, really, only in British boxing to Randolph Turpin defeating Ray Robinson many years earlier. But had that not happened, this probably
Mhm.
would have been the biggest upset in British boxing. Lloyd Hunnigan over Donald Curry, that is. And so there was obviously questions. Not everybody really understood what Donald Curry had left after that, whether or not he could come back. And on top of that, like, he looked so good and then went from looking so good to looking just like done against Hunnigan. So, he had a little bit to prove. Moved up
His
in
two
weight.
subsequent comeback fights were weird. They were both DQ wins,
Yeah,
which is
dude.
oh,
Yeah, and I mean, like, I think that they were both like headbutts or something like that, or like weird fouls. So they didn't, obviously, you're not going to really like learn a whole lot, but they at least went a few rounds. That
mhm.
being said, like, yeah, I don't know what exactly you're going to glean from that shit. And on top of that, Mike McCallum is undefeated. I think that there was probably some feeling that, like, all right, well, if Donald Curry's got anything left, then we might as well fucking put him in there. There's no point in, wasting a bunch of time. And Donald Curry, I'm sure, had some belief in himself, but damn.
Yeah. But I mean, I'll say this, the fight is another one that like fans and boxing people should be watching because it's two high level practitioners going at it. And I'll give Curry credit because he was on fire that night. Like Curry
he
was
was doing he was doing great.
he was looking amazing. I mean, he was looking like the welterweight Curry, the one that was looking like the potential, successor to Hagler. And as good as McCallum was, doing too, and I mean, not to say McCallum was getting outclassed, he certainly wasn't, but he was a step behind Curry like the whole time, you know what
He
I
was
mean?
sticking
And
with him, but getting a little
outboxed.
overwhelmed.
Yeah, like Curry was just, I mean, Curry in his prime was one of those guys that's just absolutely, I love watching Curry. Like, what a brilliant, brilliant, beautiful fighter, and like he just had this perfect style of just like the stance of how he threw. Every punch was absolutely perfect. The way he would slip. Apparently he did have one punch power when he really wanted to show it, but he was more of a compact boxer and stuff. But just like you could see why everyone thought he was going to be like pound for pound the next great thing, and the successor to Leonard, beat Hagler, all that other bullshit. But he was showing all that in the first, 4.5 rounds of this fight. And it's funny too, because Sugar Ray Leonard was on commentary for this. And, Leonard, who, what year was this? It was 87. So, had he come back to fight Hagler yet? I mean, he was coming back, obviously. What month was Hagler and Leonard?
Okay, no, that was April, so he would have,
Oh, so he
yes.
was back at this point.
So he was probably still trying to convince Hagler to fucking rematch at
Yeah.
this point.
But he had like well, for whatever it was, Leonard had like something. I mean, he had something against both guys. I know he didn't really care for Curry too much, but like for whatever reason, he was ragging on McCallum during the fight, trying to talk about how he was looking like this and he wasn't doing this and he wasn't doing that. And you can almost seem like just making little snide remarks here and there.
And he kind of
But
sucked as a commentator too.
yeah, I mean, it's very rare when like a fighter ends up being like a really good analyst because they can't sometimes can't they just can't help it. I don't know. Like I think Roy was the first one I ever heard that was like actually sounded really good. And even Roy, though, couldn't help himself, like talk about himself and say what he would be doing in scenarios and stuff like that. Like, I remember at one point when, not to veer too much off course, but like when Brewster was getting his ass kicked by Klitschko and then Klitschko started falling apart. And then at one point, Roy was like, no, no, it's those body shots in that left hook. And you see what Brewster's doing with him. That's why he should never be in there with me. Stuff like that. Like, just some dumb shit. But anyways, Leonard's making little remarks and all that. But Curry is ahead in the fight. He's ahead in the fight because, like you said, he's just a step ahead, and it's just a brilliant fight to watch. But Curry is just on firing on all cylinders. And then in round five, Curry goes over, and I forgot how it happens, but like he throws a punch and then he drops his hand slightly, and McCallum, like at that moment, just most incredible like quick thinking you can imagine. Fakes Curry out because he drops his hand low like he's gonna go for like a hook to the body, and then at mid range switches it up and lands yow! An absolutely ridiculous left hook. I mean, just awesome shot.
Just flattens him.
Flattens him. Incredible punch. Just lays him unconscious, laying there. And, when they start zooming in, you see like the referee's feet around him. So you see Curry's head just kind of like, vibrating with it and stuff. It was one of those knockouts. Just
I mean,
incredible spot.
basically what Curry did to McCrory, like fake low, go high type of thing with the hook. And except for Curry was doing great. Like he was kind of like he didn't really have any reason to think that this was going to happen, but that's when it happens. That's when you get complacent, or you're 5 rounds in and you're gliding and you're fucking a step ahead of him and you're feeling great and you let your guard down for a fucking split second against a guy like Mike McCallum and he lays you out unconscious. Just fucking that's how it goes. And that was also, I mean, I'm not going to say it was like a star making performance. Had Donald Curry been undefeated, it definitely would have been. But, having already seen him lost probably didn't hurt Mike McCallum's cause very much. But it was definitely arriving on a different stage for
Yeah.
sure.
Absolutely. I mean, that was his breakout fight. That was the one that he was really hoping to put him on the map, and it did. He ended up being on like World Boxing Magazine covers. He was featured obviously in Ring and KO because like that was a big win and a massive knockout, probably the knockout of the year, one of the best of the decade, in fact. And the first time I watched it, to bring up this video again, it was featured on 30 Great One Punch
Yep.
Knockouts. Yep. Yeah,
Dude,
1987.
it's that's all we
Yeah.
fucking like could get. We didn't have YouTube, bro. That's all we could
Same.
get a hold of. We get fucking VHS highlights and shit like that.
Yeah,
And so we
man.
could be
Like,
fucking, marking out on motherfucking VHS highlights. Oh, fucking
yeah.
crazy.
And I never, bought them from and I never bought them from a magazine. Luckily enough, the old video stores that we would have that like they would just be dedicated for movies and shit. Those don't even exist anymore, but like the ones you would see in malls, they would have the sports section would have a few boxing VHS tapes
Yep.
always there with either 30 great ones or like boxing's best of this,
Yeah, some
Muhammad
Muhammad
Ali,
Ali shit or
fucking
some
yeah,
shit.
Mike Tyson, whatever, but there would always be a few boxing videos there. And like you said, that's where we got the majority of the stuff and like the small clips that we could watch. And what's crazy though, and this is like, what like we were talking about with McCallum and like him trying to almost there on the cusp of stardom, and then all of a sudden it just gets snatched away slightly, or it just something happens immediately after this fight when, he's riding all this momentum, he loses his belt to another guy who's incredibly criminally underrated, Sambu Kalimbe. And people can be like, oh, well, he went to Italy and he fought him over there. It might have been robbed. No, he wasn't. Like, this was one of those fights that Callum Bay fought the absolute best fight of his career, and McCallum lost. It is what it is. Um, can't, like you said, you can't stay retired forever. And like a guy like McCallum, even though as great as he was, and he can work. Sometimes there's going to be a guy that's like, I'm not going to say Callum Bay had his number, but he certainly had the type of style that was going to give him McCallum fits all the time. And Callum Bay was such a supremely gifted boxer himself, and a guy that could like stand there and have the IQ to like hang with McCallum. He was like, he fought the best fight of his career that night and was able to get the win.
Yeah, and like you said, incredibly underrated. Just
Not on the fucking ballot for the Hall of Fame. We've talked about this before.
Yeah, kind of absurd, dude. And that's one of the big reasons why just the logic isn't really there for a lot of the stuff that's happening. And I'm kind of done like shitting on the place and on the institution, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. This kind of stuff. Sumbu Kalimbe being one of the most underrated fighters of that era, without question. And then, that's a legit loss for Mike McCallum. Callum Bay, like we said, just an actually very, very good fighter. A fighter whose style was an absolute fucking nightmare, total pain in the ass to deal with from
Yep.
multiple fighters. But I mean, so in point being, it's an understandable loss. It's not the kind of thing. And so you also kind of got to look at Sumbu Calibe as he's the guy who took Mike McCallum's O too. So
Yeah.
I mean,
I mean, Callum May was that dude at middleweight at that point too. It was like after Hagler retired, there was like a fight for who was going to be the number one guy in that division. And I mean, there was more high profile names because they were American. Like Frank Tate becomes IBF champion when he beat Michael Alajade, and who was WBC champ at that point? I don't know. Leonard gave it up to somebody. But when Callum Bay won the vacant WBA belt, he beat what was it, Iran Barkley. And I mean that was a win that ended up aging extremely well, considering that Barkley would end up becoming WBC champion soon after when he would knock out Tommy Hearns and yada yada yada. But like, Callum Bay was on a roll at that point. So when McCallum gave up the WBA junior middleweight title to move up to fight Callum Bay, yeah, that was a really good, a big fight, but one of those fights that definitely fell under the radar because it's the late 80s and it took place in Italy. It's not like the world's going to be watching that all over the place, you know what I mean? And like today, that would definitely be on the zone, probably as a pay-per-view, who knows, whatever, and it would have been like a big ass fight. But it's one of those fights too that like a lot of McCallum fights, if people should watch it, they just need to watch it. It's just, two brilliant guys going at it. They're both playing mind chess with each other, and Callum Bay just happened to be better that night.
and if it was the kind of fight where it was pretty nip and tuck, had McCallum gotten a close decision, wouldn't have been a robbery, but
Yeah.
like Callum Bay was just a little bit of a. The problem with McCallum is that he could get off to a slow start and he could
Yep.
kind of get lulled into a slower pace. And the problem was that if the other fighter was working during that time, McCallum could kind of fall behind on the cards. Like, his big moments or his good moments would be really good, but they would just be in between a couple of lulls, which were
Totem.
not good for the cards and worked against him. And they also actually, so he got a couple wins in the meanwhile, and this kind of thing almost worked against him against Harold Graham too. Harold Graham, another guy who's incredibly underrated, and also gets remembered, unfortunately, kind of like Milton McCrory, for a bad knockout, even though man, one of the worst, really. I mean, just one of the absolute fucking worst. But like a very, very good fighter, well schooled fighter. You want to talk about nightmare styles? Holy shit! Basically,
Yeah. Bro,
yeah,
you type of guy you want to take your stool and just hit him over the head with it because you're like, fuck it, I can't punch him anyways.
yeah, basically, like if you take Prince Nassim Hamed, except for actually difficult to hit, because Nassim Hamed made too many mistakes, and so you could actually fucking hit the shit out of him. He just had a really good chin, believe it or not. But it was just that Harold Graham, fucking crazy defense, total pain in the ass. Very, very good fighter. Had he had a little bit more punching power, would have been a little bit more complete fighter, and maybe a little bit better chin. Would have been, yeah, just fell short of winning world title as he did against Mike McCallum. But he, he got a phantom fucking knockdown against McCallum early on because McCallum slipped on some shit in the ring. But
That was an incredibly tough fight for McCallum. Like that was the one fight that we've always said McCallum has always been cool under pressure, everything like that, and just the consummate professional. But that's the one fight where he had to like flail along, and like throw haymakers and get a little
yeah,
wild and just make it rough because you have, like you said, Harold Graham is probably
there's no way to corner the fucking guy.
no, he was. I
It's like
mean,
trying to grab a fish. It's like zip
yeah.
zip 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 zip. You anytime you think you got him fucking pinned down, he goes whoop 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 whoop, and he's
Well,
out.
I've
It's
never
like
really
what
seen
the fuck?
anything like Graham before then. Like when he came on the scene, the guy was an absolute anomaly. Like, his hands down, everything he did, slip and slide everywhere.
That
And
Brendan is kind of, they called it later on a signature Brendan Ingle gym style, but that was mostly because of Harold Graham, not Nassim Ahmed. Harold
oh, a
Graham.
thousand percent, yeah. Harold Graham influenced Hamed immensely. I think Johnny Nelson did to a degree too, but definitely like Harold Graham. I mean, that was the consummate guy and probably Britain's best fighter to never win a world title when it comes down to it. But like you said, if you watch Harold Graham, even when he made his comeback in the late 90s and he ends up fighting Charles Brewer, he's still slippery as shit, all right? Like he fights Brewer in Atlantic City on the undercard of Lennox Lewis, Shannon Briggs. And the fight sometimes is on YouTube, sometimes it's not, whatever, doesn't matter. But it's a really good fight. And Brewer, is one of my favorite fighters coming up. And like Graham just makes him look like shit for like the first 8 rounds. He's slipping, he's sliding, and he's old as dirt at this point too. Graham is like 36, 37. He had been retired for a minute, had outside the ring issues or whatever, but he was still slick. And he dropped Brewer twice. It was making him look awful until Brewer finally cornered him at round 10 and it was just like fucking and just, laid him like that. But when you watch him against when you watch him against McCallum had to fight his ass off. He had to chase him everywhere. He had to like flail, corner him, land whatever he could, punch with him, and he did this in Great Britain and he did this in the UK in Graham's backyard too. So like for him to get that decision, it was like he had to fight his ass off for that. And
Yeah.
so I think actually, in my opinion, this ends up being his best run as a pro at this point. You know what I mean? Because he beats Harold Graham. Immediately after that, he fights Steve Collins, and that's a
Who was unbeaten. Granted, 16-0, but also a very high level amateur on the European scene and a very good fight, a really good fighter, probably very underrated, really.
oh yeah, I mean, considering the stuff he would accomplish later on after this, like he would go on to finish Eubank's career and essentially finish Eubank's career at the top as a top guy at least, and then he finished Nigel Bench's career and went on to have a respectable run as WBO champion, and just tough as nails do too. Like he always said that he knew that McCallum was a lot better than him, but that wasn't going to stop him from trying to like his absolute best to hang with him. And that's what he did. He hung tough with him and lost a decision, but he gained everyone's respect because I mean, he showed that he was a bad motherfucker and belonged there. Um, his next fight against Michael Watson arguably is his best performance. I mean, Watson was a really good fighter. Tragic case of what happened to him with Chris Eubank. When he suffered that brain injury and prematurely ended his career. But before that happened, Watson, everyone talks about Ben and Eubank as the two guys in the rivalry and stuff like that. Watson was right there with them early on at the cusp of 1990 because he had knocked out Nigel Benn. when Ben was undefeated. And when he fought Eubank the first time, he lost a very controversial decision. And then when the second time they fought, he was beating Eubank and dropped him until he walked into that ridiculous uppercut that snapped his head back, and then he landed awkwardly and, subsequently finished his career and almost his life, in fact. But when he fought McCallum, he gave a really, really good performance and like tried his ass off. But McCallum was at his absolute best that night, bro. And you know how you talked about how like McCallum just breaks you down and just beats you up and slowly but surely just overwhelms you. That's exactly what he did to Watson. It was a mugging near the end. Watson, there's photos of it. You can watch the video on YouTube or whatever, but Watson's face looks like he just got beat with a bat. He's bloody all over. He's swollen. He just lumped up, and McCallum has just beat the daylights out of him until the end before he stopped him.
And this was during a time when I don't think that he was technically the British middleweight champion, because there have been a couple weird splits where you know some only consider the British Boxing Board of Control, some consider the Commonwealth belt the British, and sometimes they get one together, et cetera, et cetera. But point being, he was a high level British middleweight, and I think that he had like one loss, and it was like earlier on in his career, and he was otherwise unbeaten for several years, et cetera, et cetera. And also, like you said, clearly a very, very good fighter, and gave everything that he could against Mike McCallum, but it was not enough. And I mean, not only was it not enough, but man, fuck, dude. This was one of those instances where Mike McCallum put it together and then toward the end scores just like a ooh, like ooh, nasty fucking stoppage. And yeah, this was one of those. And again, it's one of those kinds of subjects, Michael Watson, that is, that's almost like taboo because of how he ended up and because of what happened to him. But very, very good fighter who was in a whole bunch of good fights. And this was one of them. This was actually a pretty good fight.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a very good fight and a good win for McCallum, who was on a roll at that point. And after he fights Frank Minton, then he gets the rematch with Sambu Kalambe. So this is 1991. Kalambe now has been knocked out by Michael Nunn, and with that ridiculous one punch knockout that no one in the world ever saw coming. And
Yeah, even None was like, I wasn't even trying to do that. What happened?
yeah, like he walks into the shot and hits him, and then he's just like, "Oh, word?
He's
Oh,
like, oh shit. Okay, okay.
yeah,
I'll take it.
He was controlling, none was controlling the first round. I think like, the size difference was there and all that, but like Callum Bay got clipped and he got knocked out. But Callum Bay was on the comeback trail. I think he had beat Harold Graham in a rematch at this point. It was like, looking pretty good. And so, like we said, he was always going to give McCallum fits no matter what. And even though he was a little past it, like McCallum though was able to right his wrong and avenged his only defeat up until that point. And that's, two more defenses, and then we come to at the point.
He started a little earlier in the rematch too. He was a little bit busier. He started earlier. He wasn't nearly as like lulled into Callum Bay's bullshit, and like he didn't get sucked into the tactical battle nearly as much, and he applied more pressure, and he won that fight.
Yeah, he absolutely did. And from there though, another guy that was so at this point it's the early 90s, right? And so if you want to think of like a middleweight dream match that you could have made, it would have been Michael Nunn against Mike McCallum, because Nunn was the long reigning champion, McCallum also a long reigning champion at this point, and it just seemed like a natural fight that could be potentially made. Unfortunately, well, I don't want to say unfortunately because it ends up being a better fight, but then Michael Nunn ends up getting upset by an upstart by the name of James Toney. Nunn was dominating that fight and whooping on him pretty easily until Toney landed that fucking haymaker in what was it, round 11 or so? That
Yeah, yeah, the wild left.
yeah. Yeah, he lands a crazy left hand that Nunn just, knocks him on his face, and then that's another instance too where they should have just stopped the fight and then they didn't, right?
Yeah, that didn't make it. Yeah, he's like fucking like getting like pushed and beaten over the top rope and going upside down and shit because he can't even keep his feet. And they're just like, hold on, hold on. It's like, dude, don't make him kill the fucking guy.
Like I get it's his hometown, and you're trying to give him every like instance to maybe survive and stuff like that. But at this point, like the man's life is in clear danger, and James Toney, and a young James Toney at
Yeah,
that,
you
was
got a
a fucking
young,
raging
mad
maniac.
James Toney in a fucking feeding frenzy, just
I'm
fucking going
serious.
after him. Like, Stop the fight.
You know what I mean? Yeah, like bro. I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh about it, but I mean, like, there's just all things considered. When you think about it now, you're just like, what in the actual fuck? Like, Tony was already
That went
threatening to
from
kill
like
him
not like
beforehand.
that went from like surefire knockout of the year to like it was a pretty good stoppage because
Yeah.
he's like flailing over the ropes. It's just like fuck, dude.
So Tony's on the scene now, and he's like 28 and 0. And even though he knocked out none, and like he struggled in a couple of title defenses, but he's showing right away that he doesn't give a fuck. He'll fight anybody because his first title defense is against Reggie Johnson, who everybody was avoiding at that point. He gets dropped early on and squeaks by with a split decision. And soon after that, he fights McCallum. And I want to say that McCallum had to give up, yep, McCallum had to give up his belt probably for that fight because God forbid they do unifications back then, right?
But no, they wanted him to fight Steve Collins again. They
Okay.
fucking yeah, like they Steve Collins. I can't remember. I'd have to go look, but Steve Collins like got a couple wins after their fight and positioned himself for another shot. And then the WBA, fucking stupid ass WBA, were like, all right, you got to fight Steve Collins again. McCallum didn't want to, apparently. Maybe he was advised not to. I don't know, but he was, for whatever reason, wound up just giving up the belt and fighting Tony instead. So it would have been a unification.
Uh, our favorite sanction embodies. But and regardless, it doesn't even matter if there was a title on the line because a fight like this, it was just a big enough fight on its own. Like everybody knew these were the two best guys in the division. These two of the best fighters in the world. Well, Tony, I'm not sure if he was recognized as one of the best in the world at this point. Like he was still proving himself, you know?
Yeah,
Like I said, he had Reggie Johnson, then he beat up this Italian guy, I think, in his next title defense, and then he fights McCallum. So this was like Tony's breakout fight where he's gonna be like, all right, I'm fighting the legit best dude out there, and time for me to prove myself. You know what I mean? Kind of like when Haney fights someone like Lomachenko, for instance. And if that's like a good comparison. And so this fight was on TVKO, which was like the fledgling days when, some fights would be on TVKO and the other ones would be just be on regular HBO. And it's what else can be said about it that hasn't been said before? It's one of the most brilliant fights you'll ever watch.
yeah,
One of the most brilliant fights that's ever been recorded, in my opinion.
yeah. There were a number of fights kind of in this era. Well, I mean, like, I guess we and the people who were around and boxing fans during this time were kind of blessed in the sense that there were a number of fighters who were just top flight operators, dude. They talk about like, for instance, Pernell Whitaker, Buddy McGirt. That's another really just like, supreme skills type of fight. This is right up there with that kind of stuff where you're seeing two fighters who just know what the fuck they're doing in there, man.
Mhm.
They just really know what the fuck's up in there, and it's super hard for one to get much momentum going over the other because they're just know each other's fucking tricks. Like that kind of fight. And so it's a really great fight to watch two supreme technicians in there just doing what the fuck they do. And on top of that, this version of James Toney, for a lot of people who maybe are only familiar with like the cruiserweight or the heavyweight version of him or whatever, different fighter. Just a different fighter in terms of speed, mobility, and overall agility and ability. A lot of illities there, sorry, but fucking just a different fucking fighter. And again, this is more like you said earlier that Mike McCallum at 154 pounds hadn't even really like come into his own. This is more like Mike McCallum kind of, I wouldn't say necessarily peaking, but like pretty close to it though.
Absolutely. And it's like you said, bro, it's two guys that like I think McCallum was with Eddie Futch at this point, and James Toney had Bill Miller, who was another supremely talented trainer, just an incredible boxing mind. And Tony had learned everything from Bill Miller, like all the old tricks of the trade from like, the shoulder roll and doing this and the pot shotting, just the most beautiful techniques that you would see a lot of the guys from the 40s and 50s would do, because that's where Bill Miller's, era was from. Like he was really good friends with Ezra Charles and stuff like that. Like, he was showing him a lot of video of Ezra Charles and Jersey Joe Walcott and this and that. And clearly Tony picked up everything from that. As much of a knucklehead as he was not an idiot, and he knew that he needed to study this shit and to become the best fighter he could. And so that being said, I mean, it was just like you said, it was like tit for tat. Both guys, McCallum was a little bit older at this point, but I mean, like he was hanging with Tony because he was still in his prime. Like he wasn't washed up. And then like Tony at this point too, even he's had like iffy performances here and there, and he would have a lot more after this at middleweight because we found out he was just struggling mightily to make 160. But he was at his absolute best this night. Like, on the night where he really needed to prove himself because McCallum was there to try to take his belt, Tony stepped right up and like, fought his ass off. And every time it looked like McCallum was about to take over, Tony would be right there and, almost take over himself. It just kept on back and forth. They kept on out trying to outthink each other. And like it wasn't just, a lot of pausing and waiting and trying to counter and stuff like that. No, it was just these two were fighting and like, but it was just such a beautiful way about it. It wasn't just outright slugging. It was just, I'm gonna counter this, I'm gonna do this and everything. And that's why every trainer has always been like, you need to watch this fight. You need to watch these two guys. You need to study McCallum. You need to study Tony. You need to study what they do on the ropes. You need to study how they distance themselves over there, how one guy positions to try to get the next one, and Tony will move his feet to try to reposition and all that. Like there's so many nuances to this fight that just make it so fucking brilliant. And yeah, I thought a draw was actually really appropriate for how it ended. I mean, you can go both ways and say Tony deserved a close decision or McCallum could have got a close decision. And you're not going to get an argument from me either way. It was that fucking close.
It was pretty fucking close, dude. Nip and tuck. And I mean, the kind of fight where unless you're really rooting for one guy over the other, you're not really going to have a big problem with the draw because it was super fucking close, man. But I mean, and obviously the kind of fight where you have to have a rematch. Um, Tony seemed to have more respect for McCallum overall than he did for a lot of other opponents. This was a time where Tony was super fucking volatile, dude. He was just, I mean, he's still is, but like, they're doing like interviews with Tony, and he's going on fucking like hour-long rants about how he'd really like to kill his father. And it's like, Jesus Christ, bro. Like, this is a fucking straight up, like, Dr. Phil episode that you need to, like, talk to somebody about, buddy. And instead, your form of therapy is just talking to some magazine guy. Jesus Christ, somebody help this fellow. That was James Toney at the time. Like, he had a lot of pent up everything, and a lot of his psychiatric care was basically happening in the fucking boxing ring. And so, he seemed to have more respect for Mike McCallum than he had for a lot of his other opponents. He was constantly talking shit on and stuff like that. But, he also recognized that the draw was no good, that he had to come back and he had to try better. And to his credit, he did.
Yeah, absolutely. And for Tony, a guy like that, like you said, he always had a respect for a guy like McCallum. He probably wouldn't say it directly to his face back then. And I'm sure even in interviews he was threatening about what he was going to do to him and all this other shit. But he knew what he knew what he was in with a like-minded guy in terms of like boxing IQ and stuff like that, and just someone that like he had to be at his absolute best for because if he wouldn't, then he would absolutely lose.
Yep.
And Tony didn't look good in the subsequent fights coming up to that. I think the Dave Tiberi fight was after that one, like soon after, where he clearly lost that and just looked like dog shit. And McCallum only had one fight in the interim before they ended up having that rematch, which was on HBO. And even, this fight too is another absolutely brilliant fight that kind of gets a little overshadowed because of how great their first fight was. But it's another one too that was nip and tuck and really close, and that Tony could have lost that fight too
A lot.
potentially.
I
Like it was a
remember,
really, really close fight. Yeah.
yeah, like reading about the second fight. I don't remember it directly because I was not, this was
Yeah.
before my time.
Same.
But reading that, like, a lot of people were kind of pissed about the scores in the second fight because they were like, dude, this could have been another draw.
Yeah, absolutely. 114, 114 was not bad, but 117, 110 twice was absolutely ridiculous. And that's just showing like the favoritism probably of like Tony's flashier combinations as opposed to like McCallum's, consummate work that he was doing and stuff. Like you said too, because that could happen. I mean, judges like sometimes favor other shit, and McCallum can get caught or whatever, in like in a lull here and there. But it was an extremely close fight, despite what the scorecard said. And another fight too, that's just like absolutely brilliant to watch and one that should be watched, but kind of overshadowed a little bit by how great their first fight was. But even though he lost to Tony in a rematch, that didn't really deter him, and he moved up soon after. And he wasn't really active. Like he only had two fights in '93, and then by '94, he moved up to light heavyweight. And was he supposed to be a light heavyweight? No, he was never like the tallest guy or anything. You can clearly tell at this point he was carrying a little bit of punch on him, a little, at 175. But he was still a brilliant fighter. And when he fought Jeff Harding, who was a WBC champion, this was like a very, a lot of people realized this was probably going to be a very winnable fight for him to get another his third division title because Harding was one of those guys that, like, as much as we love watching him, I mean, he was a really fun fighter from the early 90s and late 80s. His from Australia, his trilogy with Dennis Andres ranks up there with with one of the best trilogies in boxing history. It's absolutely brilliant. I mean, all three of those fights were fucking awesome, especially their first two. When Andres
Yeah,
in their
fucking
first fight,
bloodbath.
First fight, Harding was getting his ass kicked for the majority of the fight. But I mean, hanging in there tough, obviously, before he scored a dramatic knockout. And what was it, the last round?
Yeah.
And then in the rematch, they were going back and forth, and it was another absolute barn burner until Andres just lost his mind in like round 7 or 8 and just unloaded with like an 80 punch combination. Just kept on going crazy, like boom, 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 over and over and over until Harding, who was an absolute rock of a human, finally just collapsed under the pressure. Like it was absurd. There was only so many fucking punches you can take, and Andres like went out in that round and was like, fuck it, either I'm gonna like do this now or I'm just gonna like die trying. And he did it. And you see Emmanuel Stewart and everyone running in there because Stewart loved that type of shit when he tells his guys to go out there on the shield and just knock the fuck out of somebody. And you see them all running around and everything. But like Harding ends up winning their rematch, their third fight. And even his like in his other title defenses that he had around that time, some of them were fun. Like he would fight guys that had no business being in a title fight because Harding was so crude and so like, slow moving and stuff like that, he would end up in wars. Before he would end up getting stopped. So, anyways, that being said,
And he swelled up and bruised and shit super easily
yeah,
too.
probably all that Foster's beer. Vegemite. I'm not fucking.
Ugh,
But
that shit's fucking disgusting.
oh my God, you don't have to tell me. But yeah, Harding came around though during that time in the late '80s when America started having that fascination with Australia, like Crocodile Dundee and Men at Work, and they even had a fucking WWF wrestler called Outback Jack.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like they were
Fucking what's it
really.
called? Motherfucking Tom Selleck, Quigley down under. Motherfuckers were just like, let's put some shit in Australia.
Yeah, everyone started loving that shit. It was absurd. But Harding by '94, he had been around for a little bit. So he ends up fighting Harding. And, like, even though he's outsized, clearly, McCallum still had enough in the tank that he was able to outbox Harding for long stretches and win a close decision. And he's champion again. So it's his next fight where actually, that was the first fight I ever saw McCallum live, watched on television myself against Carl Jones. And I had to look to see what the card was because I was like, I remember watching that fight with my dad. I didn't know who McCallum was because this is the early, early stages of my boxing fandom. Like I just watched Foreman more and became kind of obsessed from there. And this is February of '95, and so it was the undercard of Nigel Ben Gerald McClellan, which I did watch with my dad. And so I remember we watched this fight first, and neither one of us knew who McCallum was. And we weren't even like, I don't know, I was a kid at this point, you know what I mean? So like when I'm watching this and I'm not like bored, but I'm also not like really entertained either because Carl Jones couldn't do shit with McCallum. And McCallum just, at this point he's a much slower than he was at junior middleweight, but he's still got his, skills and shit. And he just works him down, beats him up, and stops him. But that was the first time I got to see McCallum live, and then from there I was intrigued enough to, definitely learn more about him, which we all did. His next fight, though, and I remember reading this in Ring Magazine, was a huge upset at the time when he lost to Fabrice Tioso.
Yeah, Fabrice Tiozzo was one of those dudes who was like, like especially at this time, because we've talked about this before on the show, where like, there were times where we couldn't fucking get a hold of tapes or footage of fighters who were like foreign, but like we would read about them somewhat frequently. And this is a little bit before my time, but this would have been one of those fighters where like, you hear about this fighter, you've heard a lot about them. And I remember hearing a lot about Tiozzo like in the late 90s too. So like, I at least knew who Teotso was, but at the same time, that was like a dude who operated out of France, you know what I mean? And rarely, God, did Teotso even fucking fight outside of France once, twice, three times?
Well, he fought in the U.S. a few times.
And okay, like four times. Fought outside of France four different times during a career of like 35 fights. So not a whole lot. But point being, like, yeah, it was more of a, hero in France type of fighter. But like you said, though, McCallum was clearly not at his best weight and in his best shape at 175 pounds.
Absolutely not. And Teotso was one of those guys too. Like he only had one loss at that point, and his long one loss was the Virgil Hill in a fight that was a really close fight. He ran Hill to the gauntlet in that one. So Teotso, a lot of people, if you remember him, because when you would see him on Showtime and stuff in the mid to late '90s, it was him as a cruiserweight when he was pudgy and just knocking around a bunch of absolute stiffs. Like those were like the dark ages of Showtime boxing. But they really were, bro. I mean, like Teotso one time defended against Terry Ray. Terry Ray, God bless him, was just an absolute club fight or nothing. I mean, he made for fun fights against guys like Kenny Keane on ESPN, but he had no business being anywhere near a world title fight. And like Teotso like slapped him around in like 2 minutes. You know what I mean? Like those were typical title defenses for him. But at a light heavyweight, he was, still sharp and like one of those guys that he put on his career best performance that night. I had never seen the fight, but I remember reading about it in the magazine because he was the fighter of the month, and then they had a really detailed description because Brian Dugan was there ringside, and he broke it down how much of a big win this was for France and everything like that. Like this was huge. Teotso scored a knockdown on him, which was like the first legit knockdown they called for McCallum's career, not the shit that you said about Harold Graham earlier.
Yeah.
And even though McCallum came back and made it close throughout and everything like that, Teotso just apparently was just a step ahead of him. And so yeah, that was basically McCallum at the really at the top there. It was almost the end at this point. You know what I mean? Like it was the end. He was what, like 37 around this point or something, and like it was just he was older. There was a whole new generation of guys out there that were taking around, but like he was still a very serviceable and technician. And so by 1996, Roy Jones Jr. now is the light heavyweight champion. And Roy, I mean, he hadn't quite gone on that run yet of just facing absolute cannons on HBO because they were forced to, air whatever fight he wanted. But he was starting to veer in that direction a little bit. And then when he fought McCallum, this was one of those fights where did this already happen where Rochigiani was gonna sue, or Roy was supposed to fight him or something? Tell me about that.
Well, yeah, the titles got split up because Roshigiani, like, I mean, I don't remember the exact details, but basically they had stripped him of the belt and they basically just gave it to like they were like, yeah, we're gonna like assign it. Um, well, there was tomfoolery from two of the alphabet organizations during this time, and that's also why they wound up getting their fucking pants suit off
Hmm.
later on. But yeah, long story short, a bunch of alphabet organization bullshit split up the titles and also made it super complicated as far as the lineal title because Rashigiani had unified. And so when they got split up, then it was like, well, then what the fuck do we do? Then Darius Mikulchevsky entered the equation after he defeated him. And so he became the lineal light heavyweight champion, but then all the belts have gotten dispersed and split up. And then Roy Jones wound up collecting the belts. And so this was right in between all of that. And Mike McCallum fought Roy Jones for like the interim WBC light heavyweight title, which wound up getting turned into like the regular, WBC light heavyweight title. But it was a dumb and complicated fucking era that the WBC in particular could have just undone. They didn't have to do all what they did, but they did because they entered that fucking no man's land where like you've made a decision and now if you go back on it, you look like an asshole and you have to apologize. So rather than do that, they just fucking trudged forward and was like, nah, fuck it, and just made it complicated and stupid. So that's what happened. But against Roy Jones, Mike McCallum was just past it, too heavy, too old. had gone too far in his career, and even so was still dangerous. Roy Jones knew it. Roy Jones fought carefully.
There's a couple of other things that are interesting about this fight that I totally forgot about because I had to go back and watch it a little bit, before the show and look up some things. And one of them I remembered it was a big controversy beforehand was that the WBC wanted to have wanted to have their own appointed judges because there was a WBC title fight, right? But the Florida Commission said no, we want to have our own judges for that. We're going to appoint our own judges. And they're like, fuck you. So Suleiman showed up and he was like, "No, I'm going to bring my judges anyways." And so there was two sets of judges for this fight. They had the Florida judges and then you had the WBC judges. And this would have been really crazy had there been some kind of controversy where the WBC judges had one guy as a winner and the Florida judges had the other guy as a winner because then, who the fuck knows what they were going to try to sanction that as. Luckily, none of that really made sense because you said Roy, basically dominated it. But then the other thing HBO tried to do, which was they never tried to do this again either, luckily was that they wanted to hook up Roy with like a speaker in his trunks or something like that. Like some kind of microphone because they wanted to make it so that he can hear the enhancement of his punches, almost like, like a video game. And so like I remember he had like it almost looked like he had like an ankle bracelet, but it was just like, inside his back the back of his trunks or something. And it didn't do shit. Like it literally didn't make any noise and didn't do anything. And like after two rounds, he got annoyed with it and took it out. And so they're like, that was it. It was just an absolute failure. One thing though I do own from that fight that I got on eBay a couple of years ago, and it's one of my favorite possessions now, is the jet as the cornerman robe of Miguel Diaz, who was McCallum's trainer for that fight. And yeah, so I ended up buying this on eBay, and like, I just absolutely love it. It's gorgeous, it's like, subtle and chill, but like it just still stands out like McCallum, you know what I mean? And the fact that like, we watched this live on television, I remember seeing, these robes and all this other stuff, and now I own one. Now I own it. Like, that's cool.
It's going to be 30 years old next year.
Yeah, huh? That's crazy.
Fucking wild. Well, and I mean, I guess that he didn't retire, but they had been talking about retirement for a while. He went from a relatively busy fighter, like fighting a few times a year, to fighting like twice a year, to fighting like once a year ish, and clearly winding his career down. Um, but I mean, it takes that kind of loss to a young gun who is just going in a different direction to, I think, to convince a fighter maybe that like it's time, dude. There were excuses with these other losses, or this happened, or I was on this territory, or I could have won. It was really close, etc. But this was not that kind of fight. Roy Jones outdid him so thoroughly. And I mean, this was also entering, like you said, that stage where Roy Jones was starting to kind of like have some fights where they were going a little longer than they should have.
Mhm.
They probably shouldn't have been televised, etc. And so I think that that was also Mike McCallum's cue. Like, that was it, dude. Maybe get one more in there, and he did against James Toney. So, all right, you're 0-1-1. Let's see if you can make it 1-1-1 and fucking enter on a high note. And once more, like he gave James Toney hell. There
Yeah.
was just their two styles were the kind of styles that meshed well on a skill level, and is just unfortunate for Mike McCallum that James Toney, especially above light heavyweight, just had more in the tank. Like he was a little bit younger, had not gone quite through the ringer as much, and that's it.
Yeah, and this was actually during the time when Tony was on the slide, when he was just not giving a shit and like, either there was a good chance you might be able to beat him if you actually like pushed yourself on him. You know what I mean? He was just no one was like taking
Had a
no one
few
was.
fights where like he got wins.
Mhm. Yeah, but this fight actually his last fight, the one you just mentioned, McCallum Tony 3, it's featured a lot on Top Rank on Tubi. Of all their fights, that's the one that they show, whatever. But it is a good fight, like you said.
Yeah, it's not a bad
Oh,
fight.
not at all. It's both guys. I mean, McCallum, even at that age, he's still like you said, he still knew how to fight. He was just a lot more slower version of it. And in the Roy Jones fight too, you can clearly see he wasn't like washed like Roberto Duran, meaning like, when Duran actually still knew how to do it, but he just couldn't pull the trigger, couldn't do anything. It was just completely baffled and beat up.
Yeah,
McCallum
Duran
wasn't
was like flailing and shit, like that shit was sad.
like
McCallum never got
McCallum,
there.
no, no, and like McCallum had actually a really good idea how to fight Roy in that fight. You know what I mean? Like when he attacked his body and he was really, jabbing with him and everything, and it gave you the sense that if he was only a few years younger, that fight could have gone a different way. You know what I mean? Like McCallum clearly knew how to fight Roy, and he wasn't wowed by his style. And even though Roy tried to say, "Oh, I wanted to carry him and give him another payday," and blah blah blah, I respected him too much and didn't want to knock him out. Yeah, he dropped him, and yeah, he won almost every round and did whatever. But at the same time, McCallum did hang with him, and Roy, he wouldn't admit it, but I mean, Roy definitely didn't want to open up too much because there would have been a
Yeah, he
chance
was
he
being
would have got
careful.
caught in some shit. Yeah,
He was
he
being
had,
careful.
there was times he got caught on the ropes, and McCallum was able to hit him with some body shots because Roy was never good to fighting off the ropes and other things like that. Like he put in a credible performance for his age when in a fight that like he knew he wasn't probably going to win. So.
Yeah, you could see the flashes of old McCallum in there, but that's how the career of every great fighter goes. They hang on a little bit too long, and yeah,
Yeah,
that's
but at least it was like respectable losses where he's still like very competitive in it, as opposed to like being knocked out of the ring, knocked out. I mean, look how Roy's career has basically ended. Look how Bernard Hopkins, who I thought was going to avoid that, how his career ended. It's very rare when the all-time greats actually retire when they're supposed to, because they never do, and then someone has to forcibly make them retire once and for all. And look at Pacquiao coming back in July. That's probably going to happen to him. So who knows? You know.
yeah, dude. Like when I saw, not to again get off topic, but like when I saw an interview, I mean, he sounds fine, so it wasn't that. It was just that they were like, "Oh, so you're what is he, 45, 46?" And I was like,
46.
"Yikes, bro! I'm
And
fucking
he looks
40."
slow in the gym too. He just, I
I
don't
mean,
know.
I'm 42 and I feel like I'm fucking 92. That's fucking 45, 46. I can't even. That's fucking crazy, yo. So yeah, but Mike McCallum obviously he held on a little bit too long, but thankfully not that long. And it sounds like I'm not a fucking expert on the ins and outs of what Mike McCallum did and didn't do after his boxing career, but I do know that he started training and had been training for a while, at least off and on. So
Yeah,
I mean, thank goodness he was able to take that knowledge from an Eddie Futch, from Lou Duva, George Benton, from those level trainers and Manuel Stewart and parlay that into, teaching whoever it was he was teaching to, the subtle tricks of the fucking trade.
absolutely. And he was one of those guys that was inducted into the Hall of Fame immediately on first ballot. First year he was eligible. And my experience with him was that I don't think he was always a very low profile guy. That's why a lot of people say, like, I'm not sure exactly what he was doing up into his career, after he retired, aside from you knew he was training fighters because he kept a low profile. He was always a low profile kind of guy. He didn't want to be in the limelight. You're not going to see him all over the place at various functions and doing this and that and all that. In fact, I can't recall him being at the Hall of Fame aside from that year he got inducted. Like I might have missed a year when I wasn't there and he might have shown up or something, but all the years I was there subsequently after 2003, I never saw him. And so what I'm getting at is that 2003 was the first year I had a chance to work on the fist casting team, which I've talked about before on the show. I had the absolute honor to go on stage and like grease up the fighters' hands before they put in like the casting and all that other shit, right? So I had a good amount of time where all these guys where I was able to sit there and talk with them and just, tell them how much I appreciated them and all this other bullshit. And so the first year I was able to do that, McCallum was one of the guys being inducted. And I was a very nice guy too. Like, like I said, not overly bombastic or anything, just a really humble dude who appreciated being there. But I'm not sure like how much he really appreciates just like being in the limelight, all that. Like you can tell it was almost like a lot to him, you know what I mean? But he definitely appreciated being there and appreciated that, he's being like respected and the fans were there and all this other stuff. And like I remember also too, he had a clothing line that he was trying to promote that he called Pugilist. And I don't think, it really took off much more than after that year or so, but like I did buy a hat from it, and I want to say it's somewhere at my dad's house. I have to go back and look for it, but I think I have something from that clothing line. But yeah, I was just really happy for the fact that I was able to get on stage with McCallum. You know, he was one of the first fighters I was able to like get his hand prepped for the fist casting, so I had a hand in making his fist. And just to talk with him, you know, just a really humble guy who was very proud of his career, proud of his family, and just proud of the fact that everyone remembered him.
Yeah, just a pretty big loss, obviously, in terms of history, but also
Yeah.
because he was working with other fighters, a loss to the boxing community. Um, just
Absolutely. Yeah, just a total loss. He's one of my all-time favorite fighters. I just immensely love watching him fight and just everything about him. And like, you know, I know he did get a chance to fight the Four Kings, but he definitely would have been super competitive with all of them, if not beating any of them. Like, apparently he used to beat the hell out of Tommy Hearns in sparring at the Kronk, and I couldn't believe that. I mean, you know, I think there's some sparring footage of them out there somewhere. I've seen clips of it at least. And they look like they were high level shit, just like it would be. Hearns was an incredible boxer, and I can see him being able to outbox um, a guy like McCallum because Hearns could outbox anybody. But that being said, Hearns wasn't going to knock out a guy like McCallum because even if he hit him with that right hand, those like McCallum had absolute steel, you know, in his chin, like we did in the Jackson fight. And who knows that like after a while, McCallum knew Hearns enough that he was going to be able to break him down to the body and maybe he was able to stop him late. In fact, that's what Ring Magazine predicted when you remember now that you have 18 million magazines, you know, in the in the mid 90s issues, they used to have the what if
mhm. Yep.
where you know, and they would do the computerized fight to try to figure out, and they do the whole scenario. In that one, when they made McCallum Hearns, they had McCallum winning by like ninth round knockout.
Yeah, they
Um,
they would do like in some of them, some issues they'd have like a whole series of fights that they would do that they
yeah,
would have like a little spread or whatever.
yep, yep. And so like they did it like a round by round, and what would happen? Hearns was getting the better of him. McCallum starts breaking him down, and then McCallum stopped him late. You know, the narrative that like Hagler and Leonard ducked him is absolute stupid because like Hagler was a middleweight who was nearing the end of his career when McCallum was on the come up, and why the fuck was he even? I'm not even sure like McCallum was on his radar if he knew who he was. You know what I mean? And Leonard, the same thing. Leonard was like in and out of retirements and only seeking big fights, and he wasn't gonna go seek out a guy like McCallum to fight. Like for what? Wasn't gonna do anything for him.
Yeah,
Not
he's
that he was
fighting
great.
Kevin Howard, bro. He was not going to be fighting Mike McCallum. You know what I'm saying? Like he was, yeah. And I guess I could see Hearns or Duran. Those line up a little bit more timing wise,
Absolutely.
but even so, it doesn't make sense. You don't duck Mike McCallum to fight Tommy Hearns. You don't duck Mike McCallum to fight Roberto Duran. You don't. That doesn't really hold up much. But he has a far better case of being. I mean, you call it duck, avoided, whatever. Perhaps being avoided than Aaron Pryor, for instance. The timing just does not line up for Aaron Pryor, in my opinion. But for Mike McCallum, it does. He was on the way up, and he has a better case for hopefully, getting those fights. He didn't, but like I said earlier, the big takeaway is that he made his own way through the sport. And not only did he make his own way through the sport, he didn't like take the fucking, the crumbs, dude. Like that fool was like, "No, I'm going after fools." And he did. So, you got to give him the respect.
Totally. And you know, one other thing too that mentioned about him is that like he always gets mentioned about how many people ducked him and all this other stuff that it's almost like his career sometimes takes a backseat to all that. And like you just look at his body of work that we went over right now. You know what I mean? He has an incredible resume. Maybe not the ones that stack up to like the Four Kings or whatever, but it stands alone on itself. Like yet, if anything, he's in the top three of the greatest junior middleweights of all time. You know, a great middleweight champion and is one of those guys that's looked upon as one of the best fighters of the past 50 years. And rightfully so.
Absolutely. No question. And it's unfortunate that he we lost him as young as we lost him. And I hope that he had a good sense of what he meant to the boxing community and what he meant to absolute nerds like us. But we respected the shit out of him, and I hope that he's resting well right now.
And I really hope that whoever, you know, he was able to train and mentor and stuff like that are able to take his teachings and bring them on to future generations because that's what's needed, man. You know what I mean? All these trainers that we've talked about before and all these people, they end up passing on and like, you know, the teachings and everything like that go along with them, you know? And then like you can't just have like generations of people that don't remember the history and don't like have these things passed on. Like everything just needs to be passed on eventually. And like, you know, guys like McCallum even though, like you said, he passed away at a relatively young age, even after his retirement, he was around the game enough as a trainer and mentor and stuff like that, that we hope that there's enough guys out there that their knowledge will be passed on in the future.
100%. Easily one of the greatest fighters from Jamaica, if not the greatest fighter from
Definitely
Jamaica.
top, definitely the best. Yeah,
And I mean, Simon Brown's pretty good. I'm just saying, but
totally.
but
I mean, yeah, yeah, absolutely. But like, this McCallum, I think, was just on
he's
another
on
level.
another level. But yeah, it's a big loss for the boxing community. So unfortunately, we had to do this show, but hopefully it helps some people grieve a little bit and helps some people kind of as a reminder of who he was, and
Yeah,
hopefully his family is also able to take that loss and do better.
absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself, friend.
Well, thanks, man. I'm sorry that we once again had to get together and do a show under crappy circumstances, but this is also how we deal with it in a way too. So I appreciate it, man.
Always, always, it's one of those things that like we always have to like pay respects to the forgotten greats or the ones that just passed on and stuff like that. And these are the people that have influenced our lives, the ones that made us fans in the first place and all that. So like it's our duty to honor them. It's the least we can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, there fighters like Mike McCallum are the reason why we do this, why we're so interested in this type of shit in the first place. So, we do kind of have a duty in a way, but I appreciate it, bro. Everybody who listened in, thank you so much. Go ahead and subscribe to our podcast if you get the chance and leave a comment, rating, all those sorts of things. Same deal for YouTube. If you watched, subscribe, leave a comment, etc. I might have no other choice but to re-enter the fucking social media fray at some point soon. We'll see. I don't know. I might have no choice. Eris, I know you're on there. Go look for Aris, Pina, and Patrick Connor, and we'll do our thing. Eris, we'll talk soon, bro.
Have a good one.